So we begin with one of the most traumatic events of the century, not only for Americans, but also for the world. September the 11th, 2001, on that day, 4 planes used as giant guided missiles were flown into landmark buildings in the United States, including the Twin Towers in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington. 2,977 people were killed, more than 6,000 were injured. A network of Islamist extremists known as Al-Qaeda plotted the attacks from Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda had strong links to the Taliban, which had been in power in Afghanistan for 5 years leading up to the attack. But this terror strike was a significant political turning point.
Boom! There was a loud crashing sound, and then there was a pause for about a split second, and then there was like a scream or two, and then everyone...
Take two. Take 2 and 2, 1. This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the 2 towers. A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way! No.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger.
President George W. Bush, who was, of course, the U.S. president at the time of the 9/11 attacks. Well, and Earl Anthony Wayne was with the U.S. State Department in 2001 when 9/11 occurred. He would eventually become the U.S. Deputy Ambassador to Afghanistan, and he joins me now from Washington, where he's currently a Public Policy Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We appreciate your presence on this extraordinary remembrance of 9/11, and I don't know where you were on that day, but a lot of people who were in New York, as well as in many other parts of America, were dazed and confused, people walking around in shock, and they say, many of them said it was sort of like Pearl Harbor, the older ones. I mean, an act of war.
Yes, well, I was with Secretary of State Colin Powell in Lima, Peru, and we were actually meeting with the president of Peru when a staff aide came in with the note about the first attack and then the second attack. And so we quickly got ready to return to Washington, but all of the foreign ministers from Latin America were there in Lima. So we first met with them, and they all expressed their support and solidarity, and actually passed a charter on democracy, the importance of democracy. And then we flew back to Washington. And so we arrived back in Washington, and the smoke was still billowing out of the Pentagon. And I think we were the only non-fighter plane in the skies, and we were escorted back by fighters once we got into U.S. airspace.
And what was the first thing that came into your mind when you heard of the planes hitting the Pentagon and the Twin Towers? Did you think that America was under attack, or did you think it was something else?
Well, when we heard of the second plane, we knew that it was a terrorist attack. And I think we were all somewhat in shock. And then we were trying to think what we could possibly do as diplomats to help respond to this. And so the first day, of course, we returned to an empty Washington, and I remember being escorted by sirens in a bus by myself back to the State Department. And then over the next several days, we thought about how we could help. And since I, at that time, was in charge of economic affairs, we devised the idea of a UN Security Council sanction on anybody who finances terrorists or provides other material support to terrorism. And that, by the end of September, became the first UN Security Council resolution of action on this matter, which became UN Security Council Resolution 1373. And that began a multi-year effort of trying to eliminate the possibilities of funding terrorism. Not eliminate it totally, but make it a lot harder to do.
And beyond that, George W. Bush, of course, was only a few months into his first term when it happened. What was his strategy for responding to the attack?
Well, I think he was formulating a strategy that became what we called the War on Terror and included a large number of hard responses, including bolstering the Homeland Security in the United States, which at that time was divided among many different agencies, and improving that coordination between law enforcement and intelligence, which clearly had not been perfect in allowing, this plot to take place. The other strategy was to start working with allies and devise agreement on certain ways forward. And this later became the involvement in various parts of the world, including Iraq and Afghanistan. But initially, a lot of what we did was on the economic and financial side, for which I was quite grateful. At the same time, there was planning that began immediately to take action against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, who were supporting them in Afghanistan. But my part of the work was working on the side of thinking through not only these sanctions, but then how could we help the countries who were clearly going to be affected by this, who did not support terrorism, because we did not want this to become an anti-Muslim effort. We wanted it to become an effort that was working against terrorists and against fanatics who were willing to use violence to achieve their ends.
And I recall reading that a decision being made to give the Taliban an ultimatum to turn over everybody from Al-Qaeda who's in Afghanistan and allow the US to verify that there are no more terrorist bases in that country, or there would be consequences. I mean, the Taliban turned that down, and that was when the US moved swiftly into military action against the Taliban government. And by December of 2001, the Taliban had fallen.
That's right. There was the details might differ a little bit, but the thrust of what you said were correct. The Taliban were given a set of conditions to act on. They did not agree to act on those, and so the United States moved to take military action against the Al-Qaeda and effectively against the Taliban regime also, because they had been providing them shelter for many years and allowing them to have camps in Afghanistan. But at the same time, we started moving to prepare for supporting the Afghan people and others after the fighting took place. So it was intended to be a dual-pronged strategy as we went forward.
Right, and the operation began essentially with airstrikes and cruise missiles targeting key sites in Afghanistan. But that would be followed by a ground invasion with special forces already, from what I understand, deployed in northern Afghanistan to link up with anti-Taliban factions and mount a ground assault. And so the time for war had essentially arrived.
Yes, both paths were being pursued at the same time, and the special forces and intelligence representatives were the first ones to be active in the country and then larger number of American forces came in following that. And then there was an unsuccessful effort to capture Osama bin Laden, which was a serious shame that he was not captured at that time. And then this perpetuated, and we perpetuated an involvement in Afghanistan, which ended up lasting almost 20 years.
Yes, we're going to get to that in a minute, because obviously you know a lot about that. You were deputy ambassador in Afghanistan, but you mentioned Al-Qaeda's leader Osama bin Laden, who at the time was said to have been based in Afghanistan, but that turned out to be a different story, because he then, I mean, that was part of the justification for moving into Afghanistan, but then he sort of slipped through America's fingers and ended up in Pakistan.
Yes, apparently he and a number of his followers retreated into the mountains, but their exit paths were not cut off, and they came out and went into Pakistan. And one of the challenges throughout this whole period of time in following years was that effectively the Taliban and Al-Qaeda had safe havens they could retreat to in Pakistan.
Well, stay with us, Ambassador. We're going to come back in a minute and talk with you a little bit more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about 9/11, 20 years after the terror attacks in the US. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enyugulu. Today, we remember the day 20 years ago this weekend when suicide attackers seized US passenger jets and crashed them into 2 New York skyscrapers, killing thousands of people. Less than a month later, President George W. Bush led an invasion of Afghanistan supported by an international coalition to eliminate Al-Qaeda, the Islamist extremist group behind the attacks, and hunt down their leader Osama bin Laden. A decade later, US troops finally located and killed bin Laden in neighboring Pakistan. The alleged planner of the 9/11 attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, was arrested in Pakistan in 2003. He's been held in US custody at Guantanamo Bay since then and is still awaiting trial. 20 years later, Al-Qaeda still exists. It is strongest in sub-Saharan Africa, but even now has members inside Afghanistan. US troops left Afghanistan this year after nearly 20 years, stoking fears from many that the Islamist network could make a comeback. Harrowing scenes there as the Twin Towers crashed. And Earl Anthony Wayne, former US Deputy Ambassador to Afghanistan, is still with me from Maryland in the Washington tri-state area. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And there was a unified sense of widespread support for military action across America and even across the political divide. I mean, there was the sense that it was essential that the US respond quickly, effectively, and successfully. And was there a sense in those early days that the mission had been carried out successfully?
I think in those early days, as you said, there was a broad consensus in the United States and with our other allies that there did have to be a response to these terrorists. And so there was a lot of support for those initial acts, even the use of military force to go in and get them. I think the first evidence that this was going to be much more difficult than we saw was when Osama bin Laden escaped and others, and that this might be a bit longer, but still there was a thought that you could persist, you could track down Al-Qaeda and others who were supporting them in Afghanistan. But then, as you know, the United States government decided to widen the scope of those in the war on terror to specifically to include Iraq. And that effectively distracted attention from Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda and became a great draw on U.S. resources. It caused tens of thousands of additional casualties, largely Iraqis, and really spread the focus much more widely and led to some abuses, serious abuses of human rights, as has been detailed subsequently.
Just picking up from what you were saying there, the distracting invasion of Iraq, looking back now, do you think President George W. Bush exercised responsible leadership in his judgment and the way he reacted to that event of 9/11? I mean, you were a U.S. diplomat under his watch, so you must have been relatively close to the White House during that turbulent time.
Well, I certainly worked closely with many in the White House and the National Security Council at that time, particularly as I was focusing on the financial and economic measures. And so I think the initial responses were responsible. We were building coalitions and partnerships across the world in doing that. We had the goodwill of many, many people in the world wanting to support us. But unfortunately, I think we made a strategic mistake in shifting our focus as we did to Iraq.
And in the event, I mean, it took US-led forces 5 weeks to topple the Taliban. The last American troops left 20 years later, and the Taliban have returned to power in Kabul. Was that how the Bush administration, of which you were a part, would have wanted the story to end?
I think not, and I think that would hold for the many, many thousands of Americans who served in Afghanistan during the last 20 years. This is not the outcome that they would like to have seen. There was a lot of hard work and goodwill, but a whole series of mistakes along the way. In a sense, we took on a much bigger and more complex set of issues than we were ready to handle effectively. And so the hard work of many and people really trying to do their very best, however, was not reflected in an effective involvement over that 20-year period of time. And I gave 2 years of my life to serving in Kabul. I know how hard everybody worked, but we faced massive problems on a number of different fronts, and we were just not able to succeed in those situations. In a sense, we took on too big of a set of tasks. We needed, I think, to be more modest in what we were trying to do.
I want to, hopefully, if we've got time, get to what you found when you went to Afghanistan as deputy ambassador. But of course, there were other negative fallouts from that 9/11 atrocity, weren't there? I mean, in its aftermath, Muslims across America had to cope with a horrifying increase in racism. And according to the FBI, hate crimes against Muslims rose by 1,700% in 2001. And overnight, Muslims found themselves having to prove they were patriots.
I agree. That was a terrible repercussion of doing this, of this situation. And I wish we could have been better as a society and as a government in stopping that. Unfortunately, fear was motivating many people, fear and hatred, and that's not the way that you should be making policy, especially towards your fellow citizens. And it reflected a lack of understanding of many Americans that there are a great variety of believers in the Muslim faith, and that these terrorists were of a small, extreme sect group within that much broader population. So that was a terribly negative effect. And that's why, from my position in the State Department, I, working with others, made special efforts to reach out to Islamic countries around the world and find ways to support them during this period of time. And we also were working from the State Department with all of our authorities at the airports and borders to try to get them to be respectful of individuals from Islamic countries who were coming into the United States. Because there was a great pressure to crack down and not to make the same mistakes that have been made in letting those terrorists in previously.
And of course, just returning to Taliban, I mean, you went there in 2009, I believe, as ambassador, deputy ambassador. I mean, it became pretty apparent soon after the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan that using the military might of the US and its allies to crush the Taliban was the easy bit. I mean, creating a stable of Afghanistan was the really difficult part, and you can attest to that, I believe.
Yes, it's very hard to accelerate the development of countries socially or culturally from the state they're in to what took us several centuries of evolution. And it was clear when I got there and talking with all those who'd been working that this was going to be a long process if we wanted to be successful. And our most successful programs were building health clinics, building schools, and gradually educating new generations to come forward that had a different view of the world because they had access to the world, they had access to education.
Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne, I want to thank you very much indeed for spending the time with us today. And Earl Anthony Wayne was a former US Deputy Ambassador to Afghanistan.